What criminal committed an almost perfect crime, and what was the thing that messed it up? The Dunbar Armored Robbery, the largest cash heist in U.S. history. A six-man inside a job to rob an armored cash depot. They set up a house party as an alibi, used the keys to get into the cafeteria, and waited in there until all employees came in on the break, then ambushed and subdued them without firing a shot or raising an alarm. They then loaded the money bags, with over $18 million, into a hall, destroyed the CCTV tapes, and returned to the party. Then they sat on the money for 6 months before hiring a crooked lawyer to set up a real estate money laundering scheme to avoid suspicion. 2 years after the robbery, one of the men paid a real estate broker with a stack of money still wrapped in the original currency strap. The broker immediately reported it to the police. After being arrested, he cracked under interrogation, confessed to the robbery, and ratted out his partners. Edit. All the men have since finished their prison sentences, and most of the money was never found, so there's a chance they still won. That's an incredibly stupid way to get caught. It's because they were too impatient and/or greedy. Bars from a reputable refinery, serialized and papered, are worth more than the melt value or spot price you see on the stock exchange. As I write this, the melt value of gold is 2,076.80 per troy ounce. But having the guarantee of a refiner like Pomp Suisse or the Perth Mint, known worldwide for their quality, is worth an extra $100 or so in the cost of your finished bar. If you want American Gold Eagle coins, Canadian Maple Leafs, or South African Krugerrands, that also carry a premium of more than $100 per coin. On the other hand, selling scrap gold from a jeweler, home-poured bars, and mined-panned gold from the earth to a refiner will not get you melt value either. This brings that alleged melt value into question if you think too hard. Anyway, a gold refiner might only be between 85 to 95% of the melt value, and most refiners have a minimum they'll buy. Even if you gave them a hand-cast brick direct from those bank vault bars, they're going to go through the whole refining process so that when they stamp their name and serial number on it, they know its purity firsthand. That costs money, which you don't get back. And if someone in Naples reports 100 kilos of gold stolen, and you show up at Pomp Suisse a few days later with 100 kilos of hand-poured bars? Obvious. So you have to either sit on it until people no longer connect it to the robbery, or portion it out to lots of smaller refiners, where you are no longer getting that 95% return from the refiner, but now only 90% or 85% due to batch size. So the guys in the Italian job could have gotten away much easier if they were willing to accept losing a few percent to fees and accepting that not all of the payday was going to happen right this instant. I feel like the best way would be to immediately divide up the money with everyone taking their share and disappearing never to see each other again, and to act under the assumption that someone was going to crack so you can have no links to your old life. I'm not sure 1/6 of $18 million is enough to basically torpedo your life like that, though. I'm surprised that guy wasn't whacked by the others for that dumb move. That one dude who robbed a bank by hiring a bunch of people from Craigslist to show up wearing the same outfit he was and wait outside, he would have gotten away, but a homeless man saw him do a practice run the day before and after the robbery told the police. DB. Tuber was the name the press gave him as he escaped on an inner tube down a creek. Also, he robbed an armored car, not a bank. His book is called Heist and High. Anthony Curcio is his name, and he wrote a very interesting book. He planned his robbery for months. He planned to use pepper spray to subdue one of the guards, and to convince himself it would work, he pepper sprayed himself. He also moved boulders out of the creek for months before to make sure his escape path was clear. Tubing down a river seems like a terrible getaway plan. You couldn't possibly think of a more predictable mode of transportation. He wasn't just floating. He rigged a cable system and pulled himself upstream a few hundred yards before crossing the creek and exiting. Not really, he made several other mistakes too, including doing zero planning of what to do after getting away with the money. Also, all the people he hired to dress the same way as he didn't do anything to foil the investigation, since the one guy who was running away from the bank was the guy they were after, not the 30-plus people standing around the bank looking clueless. Predictable route, but his plan was predicated on a very fast getaway. He only went up, notably he went upstream, not down, 200 yards, and then came out of the river behind some buildings, was able to change his clothes very quickly, and then hopped into the trunk of a car someone else drove him out in. Incidentally, this accomplice was never caught. That is, The tube was a smokescreen to make sure no one could catch him getting into the other vehicle. Most modern thieves could make a decent living out of the same professionalism they put into scamming people. It just pays better, I believe. Despite being an awful crime since they mostly look for elderly or incapacitated people and using a laptop making them believe whatever. And they make big figures. Millionaire for 3 days until you're caught and go to prison for decades. He could have bettered his life immensely if he put half of that effort into something productive. John George Hay killed up to 6 people between 1944 and 1949 by either clubbing or shooting his victims and then disposed of their bodies by dissolving them in concentrated sulfuric acid. He would then fraudulently sell their assets, properties, etc., and pocket the cash. His workshop contained no drainage, so he simply poured the remains on a pile of rubble. His last victim, an elderly victim, disappeared, and 2 days later, he accompanied the victim's friend to the police station, where police discovered his history of fraud. At his workshop, the police found papers concerning his earlier victims, dry cleaning, and jewelry tickets for his last victim. A pathologist examining the human remains found parts of a pelvis, gallstones, and dentures on the rubble. Hay then claimed he had killed his last victim, destroying the body in acid, and completely misunderstanding the legal term of corpus delicti, claimed that he could not be charged as there was nobody to determine a crime had taken place. The man went to the gallows. Edit. Hay came from a particularly devout Plymouth Brethren background and frequently had vampiric dreams of being offered blood to drink. In his police interview, he tried to plead insanity in the hope that he would be sent to Broadmoor, asylum prison, but of course that fell through. A draft dodger, Hay spent much of WW2 in prison for crimes related to fraud and embezzlement. In jail, he experimented with dissolving dead mice in sulfuric acid stolen from the prison workshop. People he killed. The McSwan family, the senior McSwan was his employer. He murdered the son, then claimed that he had fled to Scotland to escape being called up for the army. As the war was coming to an end, the McSwans wondered why their son wasn't coming home. So in luring Mr. McSwan into his basement flat workshop, bludgeoned him to death, then sat him up in a chair, before luring Mrs. McSwan and doing likewise. The Henderson couple. Mr. Henderson, a former Army medic and private doctor. Hay befriended this couple, who had just moved into the area. At a housewarming party in which Hay played piano, he stole Henderson's service revolver, which he used to shoot the Hendersons with some time later. After murdering the Hendersons, he stopped at a cafe and had a bunch of poached eggs on toast and tea before finishing off the job. Mrs. Duran Deacon, a wealthy, long-time resident widow who resided in the Onslow Court Hotel in Kensington, London, where Hay also resided. In all of these murders, he would strip the bodies and possessions of jewels, fur coats, etc., and take life insurance and conveyancing papers with him, which he would cash in on. He also claimed to have drank a pint of blood from his victims, but that is likely his insanity plea. I love how, according to this guy's logic, dropping someone into acid while they're still alive or burning them to death would have been unimpeachable crimes due to the legal system supposedly having no concept of object permanence. Did he just think that the police sat around wringing their hands at everybody someone committed arson because there was no longer a house? Fun fact 1. The last victim's dentures were a main piece of evidence against him in the trial, and the pathologist who examined them is considered one of the founders of forensic dentistry. Fun fact 2. Hay bequeathed an outfit to Madame Tussaud so that his wax figure could be dressed authentically. I believe the figure is no longer on display, but it was still there in the 1970s and 1980s. He completely misunderstood corpus delicti, body of crime, believing that without a body, he could not be charged and convicted for a crime. Corpus delicti is the principle that a violation of a crime has been committed and that you can still be charged if the crime is proven. No literal body is needed. Oh boy, that guy was strange. The Antwerp diamond heist, the perfect heist of the century, where an Italian gang stole 100 million gems. While leaving Antwerp, they disposed of the disguises and the tools used, but one member of the gang was too lazy to burn everything as instructed. Among the rubbish, the police found envelopes from the Antwerp Diamond Center and a receipt for a sandwich bought at a store close to the center. They recovered video footage of the sandwich store and busted the mastermind of the heist, who didn't give up his mates, but some were later identified. Some of the stolen diamonds are still unaccounted for. Having a receipt seems to be a common way to get caught. Tell that to my local police department after a thief broke into my place of work and stole 3 iMac Pros. While he was walking around, we saw something, on the camera recordings, white fall out of his pocket as he placed his flashlight back into the same pocket. It was an ATM receipt. A transaction from less than 17 miles away within 30 minutes of the moment we were broken into. Detectives said it was circumstantial. He was never caught. We haven't heard any additional info in years. Thankfully, our insurance covered it. It's not circumstantial if they watched him drop it. Even if he had somehow met with someone and gotten the receipt from them, it would still be enough of a lead to find the person he got it from and figure out who they met within those 10 minutes. Can't be a long list. Even if it wasn't his receipt that was a smoking gun to solve the case. They just didn't want to. Was it a minority and/or a woman reporting the crime? That doesn't help them care, unfortunately. The crazy thing about the whole thing is the maximum time you can spend in prison for nonviolent theft in Belgium is 5 years. The mastermind served 5 years and much of the loot has never been recovered. The Little Shop of Crime did an episode of this on YouTube and it's amazing. His channel doesn't have a ton of subs, which is a shame as his content is well worth a look. I didn't know about this robbery until I watched it. Well worth a look. Also, there is a movie based on this heist. Wolfgang Beltracchi made millions with forged paintings he painted all himself. He was ultimately caught because he once accidentally used paint that contained a very slight amount of a substance that wasn't used in the days of the original painter. I get that selling priceless artwork would be a highly coveted goal, but if you can recreate an exact copy so well that it takes a chemical test on the paint itself to notice the difference, is there not a creative bone in his entire body? This makes him better than I thought. Different times and all, and it's maybe more acceptable now thanks to AI, but he could have marketed himself as doing custom artwork commissions for people, creating them anything they want in the style of whatever artist they wanted. That would have been a fine career, right? Not really. There are a few thousand imitators of Leonardo who on their best day can come close to his work. There's only one Leonardo, and if you want to make money, a lost Leonardo is your ticket. Remember the hubbub from the last Lost Leonardo, the Salvator Mundi? It sold for almost $500 million with the illusion that it was an autograph work of the master. It turns out it's a workshop work. Only around 20% is by Leonardo, and it's restored to hell and back. And since that information was made public, even the Saudis who own it are too embarrassed to exhibit it in the Louvre, Abu Dhabi. His story is very cool, but it also proves that there's very little interest in the art world to expose forgeries. Basically, everyone involved in handling his paintings made a profit, and the only victims were some rich guys who were upset the Van Gogh or whatever they bought wasn't real. And even they wanted to believe they had the real deal. The backstory he always gave was that the dead father of his wife was a big but unknown art collector whose pieces they'd sell from time to time. Which seems like you'd be able to disprove pretty easily if you bothered to dig a little. I worked in the federal prison system. Met a man in his mid-30s who was serving time for a series of bank robberies. His arrest was a complete surprise in his area. Model citizen. Married young kids. Volunteered and gave generously to his kids' school. His bank robberies were intricately planned and well-timed. One of his underlings decided to open up his own bank robbing business. He wasn't as smart and ratted out our man when he was caught as part of his plea deal. Reminds me of my relative and his moonshine business. Proceeds went to both his household and the community, including the trunk of local sheriff deputies. LOL, I've heard of others selling drugs or moonshine while donating to the community. My buddy's dad used to sell meth, the whole county knew. But he was always left alone because he kept his customer base in check and had a strict "don't sleep where we all eat" policy, meaning you steal from someone or cause a ruckus and he'd blacklist you. From what I saw, it was some glass grade thing too, so they never wanted to give him up as a source. Sometimes the order you bring is worthwhile too. Not to promote the sale of meth, but if we don't need more people like that in the business. I volunteer for a group seeking overdose and suicide prevention. This includes harm reduction strategies. We work out of a county office created in the 80s to support recovery. I made a joke, as a new member of the community, that even I know where the big-name drug dealers live and how they move their products, so why aren't we stopping this nonsense? Just a flat response of, they're too well connected. We all see it and feel helpless to stop it. I think the burden would be lighter if there was some type of accountability and expectation of pro-social behavior. Addiction happens, but we can work towards removing the stigma and hope doing so leads to recovery. Before I met that man, I used to think all tweakers were just useless guys. He was cut from a different cloth. In an ideal world, he would have never sold meth, but in that same world, he wouldn't have needed it to continue functioning in daily life either. He had some kind of disease where his joints were slowly solidifying, and it was painful AF for him to move around sober. But man, if he couldn't tell you where every local tweaker lived, how they made their dope dollars, and how long they've been spinning. He was a hilarious, hardworking man who loved his community. He just relied on a heavily addictive drug to continue his life. I think it'd do a lot of good for recovery overall if more people were willing to dive into the person of each addict and find those redeeming qualities. It would show them that they aren't worthless like so many addicts think. I've met so many people struggling. One thing I often hear is comments about their sense of worth. Intellect is a big one. Many claim to be unintelligent. I like to send them an illustrated chart of Howard Gardner's 9 intelligences. If you're unfamiliar, definitely pull up the image. It hasn't failed me yet. Each time, there's a spark of realization as they feel recognized in one or more of the types of intelligence. Substance misuse often has deeper roots. Something led them to it, and more than dependence on the chemicals themselves keeps the person going back rather than seeking sobriety. Gabor Mate is a good source to explore the topics of addiction and trauma. That's only illegal because you aren't giving the government their self-decided cut is easily the most corrupt crime in the country. It's extremely hard to muster a moral argument against it when the only difference between illegal contraband and legal merchandise is that the person selling it's paid a few $1,000s to file some paperwork. This story reminds me of Gus Fring. There's the story of Daniel Rigmaiden. He was a scam artist who defrauded the government out of hundreds of thousands in tax money. He was eventually caught, but was so confident that his methods of avoiding capture were thorough that he thought law enforcement had to have been cheating in some way, abusing power. When caught, he turned whistleblower. This kid was smart. Per the documentary IMDb, he evades the FBI for months. Once captured, he uses his time, then in prison, to investigate. His obsessive search for the truth led to a groundbreaking discovery. Law enforcement used a secret technology called a stingray to intercept his phone calls and personal information, as well as those of millions of unsuspecting Americans. He takes his discovery public, and the revelation not only carries implications for his case, but also for the fate of the Fourth Amendment. The stingrays are cell site simulators, or IMSI catchers, invasive cell phone surveillance devices that mimic cell phone towers and send out signals to trick cell phones in the area into transmitting their locations and identifying information. When used to track a suspect's cell phone, they also gather information about the phones of countless bystanders who happen to be nearby, as law enforcement can drive down any block with one turned on, having it connect to every single mobile device as it moves down the street. Mobile cell towers essentially gather your information without your knowledge. There was an episode of a docu-series on Netflix about this case. I think this one might have covered more than one episode. I thought it was interesting that he took his case to court, technically lost, but then if I remember correctly, they ended up releasing him on time served. I looked it up and he could have gotten a life sentence. They wanted to be rid of him after he exposed this. At least that's what I think. Cell towers collect your info all the time, and the cops can request that information. There isn't much difference between the two. But the key difference being police collecting that sort of information indiscriminately and without a warrant constitutes illegal search and seizure, which directly violates citizens' constitutional rights. So yeah, actually there is a bit of a difference between that and having a warrant to obtain specific information from a cell provider. The Friday night bank robber was the most prolific in U.S. history. I believe he had a master's degree in something analytical like math. Was a martial arts instructor. He figured out there's a time of the year in the Northeast where it would be dark out just before the banks closed. He used motorcycles to drive through the woods to these banks and rode it back through the woods to a U-Haul truck he had waiting and would put the bike into the truck and drive away calmly. He did this for a long time, kind of like the robbers in the movie Point Break. He would stop for the rest of the year, which had the police guessing. They couldn't figure out patterns for a long time. Years later, the police started to catch on with his idea of doing it on Friday nights in the Northeast, and from video knew he was probably into martial arts. But that doesn't exactly narrow it down. Dumb luck. Some random kid stumbled upon his buried cache of things like a gun, gloves, mask, cash, etc. in the woods. They turned it over to the cops, and that's how they ended up finding out who he was. The FBI gave him some deals where he worked with them and banks to tell them how to prevent bank robberies. Crime doesn't seem to pay unless you do it big time. Rob a bank or two, kill a few people. You're going to prison! But commit dozens or hundreds of crimes, and you can be useful to the police in preventing it from happening or by ratting out everyone else. It makes sense in a way, but in another way, some people committed so many nasty crimes and they simply got away with it. Got me interested in this guy and looked him up, finding another interesting story involving him. Turned out a guy that a cop that he shot in 1981 died almost 5 years ago, and the death was because of the complicated of that bullet wound, and his old cop buddies wanted to charge the robber with murder. The whole thing sounds like a very fun, maybe not fun, legal debate for some lawyers. In 1995, Mark Winger of Springfield, Illinois wanted to kill his wife Donna, IRC so he could carry on an affair, and the perfect scenario came. A week before her death, Roger Harrington was her shuttle driver on the way home from the St. Louis airport, and he reportedly spoke about always getting high and having orgies. In turn, the Wingers complained to the shuttle company. Then, Mark calls the police claiming that he shot Roger after he caught him attacking Donna. Despite the contradiction of Roger being shot in a way that Mark did not claim happened, the case was shut, and Mark was viewed as a hero for killing the man who killed his wife. However, in his infinite wisdom, Mark wouldn't stop asking the police about the case, despite it being ruled as closed. Also, he tried to sue the shuttle company for Roger's alleged action, to which the company started their investigation, which showed that the events couldn't have gone the way Mark described. The final nail came when his affair partner came forward to the police and described their affair, which led to further re-examination of evidence that showed it was staged. Mark was later tried and convicted in 2002 and sentenced to life without parole. In another derp moment from Mark, he was later given an extra 35 years for trying to solicit the murder of his affair partner and his rich friend, who refused to bail him out from behind bars. The main piece of evidence is a 19-page handwritten plan for how he wanted the murders to be carried out. I'm not a law expert. If you're sentenced to life, what do 35 extra years even do? It's there so that, hypothetically, if the life sentence were to be overturned on appeal, he would still not be released as he would have to serve the 35-year charge. That's normally the case when you see people get given multiple life sentences. In cases like those, they don't want to risk the person successfully appealing and thus being released from prison. So they give them multiple life sentences so that each one must individually and successfully be appealed. I think he wanted to show he was smarter, knew better about fire. If I remember correctly, some of his fires were on his way to and near a firefighter convention. His way of besting all those firefighters, I suppose. I think he also went back to his fires to watch or record it. His ego took a hit, obviously, I guess. Joseph James DeAngelo, otherwise known as the Golden State Killer, the East Area Rapist, and the Visalia Ransacker. The guy was a one-man crime wave. In 12 years, he committed at least 13 murders, 51 rapes, and 120 burglaries. As the East Area Rapist, he would often select his targets months in advance, conduct extensive reconnaissance, learn the routines of the occupants, and sometimes break in advance of his attack to plant his weapons and ligatures, and he would make threatening hang-up calls in advance to create a sense of fear. I won't go into details about his attacks, but he had a whole routine and everything that he would go through. And even though the sketches of him were near enough accurate, and the criminal profile of him was dead on accurate, for example, they correctly identified the attacker as working or having worked in law enforcement and the military, and JJD was a police officer at the time of his crime spree. They never even came close to finding him. When he was arrested, it was the first time he had ever come to the attention of the police. He didn't even have any DNA on file for them to match when that became a thing. That was how good he was at staying off the radar. The reason he got caught? Genealogical testing. You know those test kits that people get from services such as 23andMe and Ancestry? Well, the police ran the DNA samples through a database used by those services and identified his relatives. They eventually found someone closely related enough to him that they could identify him. So he hadn't even submitted his DNA for testing. One of his relatives did. The guy must have been so shocked when the police showed up at his door. Patton Oswalt's late wife wrote a book about him and helped coin his nickname, but she died before seeing him get arrested. The East Area Rapist was his original nickname and what he was most famous for. His murder spree in southern CA didn't really have a name because the 9 murders were hard to be linked, but when it was determined they were linked, he got the name Original Night Stalker, since he did it before the Night Stalker. Patton Oswalt's wife coined the name the Golden State Killer as a more catchy version compared to East Area Rapist Original Night Stalker. Then, when he got caught, it came to light that he was also the Visalia Ransacker, which was a string of crimes even older than the East Area Rapist. I actually met the guy while at work. We were responding to an incident on his same street. I work for the fire department. And as we were arriving, we saw him give us a quick wave, just being friendly like any normal person would. He was standing in his front yard with a long tool in his hand, maybe a rake or something along those lines. Afterward, we loaded the patient into the ambulance and it departed. He walked across the street and started chatting with us. He asked about his neighbor whom we had helped, mentioned he worked in law enforcement for a long time, and made some small jokes about his job and ours before we said our goodbyes and left. Never thought anything more of it until the news story broke out, and my crew and I simultaneously all looked at each other as we recalled who that guy was just a few months prior. He was also the original Night Stalker. He committed so many crimes in so many ways, he was given 4 separate nicknames because they only figured out decades later he was all one person. He's an evil person, and even worse when I saw him faking some illness and having to be wheeled into the courtroom in a wheelchair. But he absolutely had us fooled just like everyone else. You would have never known this friendly neighbor type of guy was the GSK.